What's up, guys? It's Fate, and I got another audiobook here to discuss with you guys today. So, we're checking out Streets of Laredo, which is a sequel to the famous Western novel Lonesome Dove. These are, of course, both by Larry McMurtry. Now, Lonesome Dove is one of my most favorite books of all time, across my entire life as a reader. It is an amazing book, and I was extremely excited to get a chance to check out this audio book version of the sequel, Streets of Laredo, and I wanted to give a quick shout out to Libby for having this on queue so that I could get in line and check it out. Thank you so much to my local library and Libby. I'm really, really grateful. I was apprehensive, though, about this audiobook. We actually shift narrators from Lee Horsley, who narrated the famous Lonesome Dove in its audiobook edition, to Daniel von Bargen. Now, there are a couple reasons I was apprehensive. One, just the fact that it's not Lee Horsley, but two, this is Daniel von Bargen's only audiobook, and I was able to really quickly find that through a brief search. What did lift my spirits a bit more was realizing that Daniel von Bargen is a very accomplished, or I should say was a very accomplished, actor. Rest in peace to Daniel von Bargen. It seems that he led a pretty tumultuous and rough life toward the end, but he had a very accomplished career in terms of being a character actor who was active from all the way back in the 70s through the early 2000s. Now, this being his only audiobook that I could find, we're going to see a few quirks and a few things that are just unlike any other narrator that I've checked out in my lifetime. And I want to check that out and talk about it really soon. I also wanted to really quickly talk about Larry McMurtry, our lovely author for this book and its prequel. Larry McMurtry is nothing shy of an extremely accomplished American author. It's hard to begin with where his accomplishments are most prominent and what I want to include here, but in terms of mainstream and across-the-board accomplishment, he won awards like the Pulitzer and the Spur for Lonesome Dove alone, not to mention other things like his novels have been adapted into miniseries and films multiple times. Those pieces of production went on to win boatloads of nominations and several awards. In fact, he even wrote this book, which likewise was adopted into an award-winning series, at a friend's kitchen counter while recovering from heart surgery. So that's just remarkable. He is absolutely an author by nature, and he passed away in 2021, unfortunately. But, I mean, a very, very accomplished individual, masterful in his grasp of literature. He, as an author, I just want to put in my own personal 2 cents. There are few authors that do such an astounding job of putting you in the minds of their characters. From the big to the small, bit to major, you feel like you are somehow residing in the brain of those characters, but it isn't this meticulous, massive, and arduous undertaking. He can do it so naturally through his work, and it is a beautiful aspect of Larry McMurtry's fiction. And I really just urge anyone who's checking this out to look into his bibliography. You may not like the Western variety in terms of the genre and the subgenres that spring from it, but I find it to be a wonderful type of literature to engage with. It is very romantic and beautiful, and Larry McMurtry does perhaps one of the most amazing jobs of it out of many authors that I've checked out within the genre. So, let's start to talk about this audiobook. The book itself, Streets of Laredo, is set several years after Lonesome Dove's conclusion, and it is important to note that Lonesome Dove is already set in like the Sunset period, the end of the era of the Wild West or the Old West. And Streets of Laredo, of course, is even further along. So we have a lot of that theme of, man, these guys were already old, now they're really old, and their time is really past, and that's a major aspect here. And I think that that kind of thing is helpful if we're going to be switching over to a completely different narrator. Now let's talk about that narrator. The narration is quirky and markedly different from Lee Horsley's narration. It is just an overall different production, and it's going for different things. You can tell that this is from an era where perhaps audiobooks weren't so mainstream just yet. It opens with a fairly badly mixed narration and harmonica solo. There is a harmonica playing as a few quotes are read, and our narrator is reading them. It is almost drowned out by the harmonica, and in case you go and check out this audiobook, I need to preface all of this with the harmonica goes away in like 90 seconds. It is just there at the very beginning, shows up again at the very end, and they don't even try to talk over it at the very end. But at the beginning, you get what is supposed to be a cool little opening sequence, and it's just not done too great, and at this point, there's no fixing it. So it is what it is. Try to just bear with it and not completely close out the book, because I was cringing quite a bit. So I just want to let you know. Moving on from there, Daniel von Bargen has an interesting way with this narration. He has a lot less of a smooth, flowing prose narration. It actually opens up, and in the first act has quite a few almost unnatural pauses to it. Like, as if he really is having to read the text several times while he is narrating to refresh his own memory. It was jerky, start and stop at times, and had some strangely conversational pauses and moments in its narration. It seems to almost completely vanish as time goes on, and I can't 100% tell you if that's just me getting used to it and starting to grow accustomed to it, or the fact that it does sort of alleviate as the narration goes on. I've noticed throughout this narration, likewise, that there is a very unique quirk to Daniel von Bargen that I alluded to earlier. He has this way of narrating third-person omniscient sentences in a recently used character voice. Now, occasionally, this is used for just describing the thoughts of the recently voiced character, and in those cases, it makes perfect sense. If we just got a line from Joey Garza, and we're going to then cover the thoughts and the aspirations and the feelings of Joey Garza, then it does somewhat make sense to narrate those in a voice almost identical to the dialogue voice of Joey Garza. That said, occasionally it was just third-person omniscient prose or exposition being read in the character's voice, and that was very odd at times. It was just something I had to get used to. As I said, this is Daniel von Bargen's only audiobook narration, and it's a quirk. It may have been ironed out across several other productions as he carved his niche in this sort of production, this sort of work. But given that this is Daniel's only narration, and that it comes after a many-year-long career as an actor, I think that it is deliberate. I think that it is a very intentional and unique performance within this medium, and I didn't hate it. It was just strange and particularly unfitting at moments where we were not discussing the thoughts or feelings of the character, and their voice just kind of lingered there. There are many quirks within this narration, and it almost makes me wish that one could go back in time and write a friendly little letter to our narrator just to ask if there's any fun story behind certain quirks within the narration. There is a character, one of my favorite introduced in this book, named Famous Shoes, and I just kind of did the thing I'm talking about. In the narration, Daniel von Bargen has a strange pausing intonation when reading a sentence that was just referring to dialogue from the character Famous Shoes. He will say, "Famous Shoes said," many times, and I wonder if it was a self-consciousness thing, if perhaps during original takes of the narration, it all slurred together in one quick sort of phrase, "Famous Shoes said," which just probably sounded unclear and unenunciated. That said, these are little minor quirks. My bigger gripes with the narration are on the prose narration and its strange start and stop pace. And, of course, some of the character voices are just a little bit lacking. We start off with a fairly weak narration, and I don't know why it wasn't redone, because it seems that by the end of the audiobook, we have a much stronger narration and we have a much stronger sense of who the characters are, what they sound like, and why their voices are so differently intoned and so differently performed. Toward the opening portion of the book, many of the voices are very similar. You have Woodrow Call, Mr. Brookshire, Charles Goodnight, and etc. All these masculine voices blend together quite a bit too much. They don't have the distinction that they had in Lee Horsley's narration of Lonesome Dove. But as we get further into the novel, by part 2, etc., we have very clearly distinguished voices, and the voices are performed well and substantially different from each other. One place where this narration perhaps shines a bit more than Lee Horsley's is in the ability that Daniel von Bargen had to perform various accents. I would love to go ahead and go back and give a comparison one-to-one against the accents performed across this book with the accents performed in Lonesome Dove. They are very enjoyable, and the breadth of voice acting that is done for all of these characters has made it an extremely positive experience, a very enjoyable audiobook, like the Lonesome Dove narration. I still ended this book feeling such an adoration for our cast of characters. The modulation done is fantastic, as themes of death and violence and loss of life are all major throughout this novel and its prequels. As such, the ability to modulate between the emotions and the spectrum of vitality from barely clinging to life to full of vim and vigor is extremely enjoyable and fitting for the atmosphere and the gravity of the text. It is tricky to decide exactly how I would rate this audiobook narration in terms of a ranking, a tier, or a scale. It resides somewhere between a very high B and a low A. It was very enjoyable. It was unique in certain aspects, like I discussed, and I ultimately found that it very much did justice to the story. It wasn't a tarnishing narration. I may have just had a slightly better opinion of the previous narrator. Interestingly enough, this was the second book ever written in the series, and 2 prequels to Lonesome Dove are written to precede it, and for those, to my understanding, a more audiobook geared narrator ends up being the narrator in question. It's interesting, and it's a great piece of work for me to go tackle. This series that I love so much has at least 3 different narrators. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that. But I want to talk about the text itself, this text that I adore so much. It is a fairly long novel. It is 20 plus hours long, and it checks all the boxes for me in terms of what I was hoping for and what I was wanting to revisit this world with. It is clearly a different work. It is a continuation, but it is its own work, and it is not afflicted with hangover syndrome where we're getting the same work just basically rehashed. There are a few recurring tropes, but we definitely deal with a lot of the same themes. Themes of rampant violence, lawlessness, dirty justice, and the bleakness of the environment and of these situations in this rough time. It is often quoted that Larry McMurtry didn't fully embrace the success of Lonesome Dove because he didn't want people to romanticize the Old West. He wanted people to understand the rough times, and he wanted to write about rough folks in rough times. And he did an excellent job with this. Of course, we still actually give a damn. That's an amazing thing about these novels, is that they cover these themes, these gritty, dark, nasty themes, the edge of humanity, the beastishness of lawless and ruthless humanity. And yet, we are put inside the minds of these characters so often that we can really appreciate what they're going through and root for almost all of them. And of course, we still hate some of them, but we even understand where they're coming from and what they're doing and why they're doing it by the seamless way that we're transferred over into receiving their stream of thoughts and their ideas on life. Likewise, I really appreciated the quasi-historical nature of these novels. It shows that McMurtry had a great deal of appreciation for the Old West and for the figures who made a name for themselves. Imagining that McMurtry made himself aware of all these historical figures prior to instantaneous gratification and instantaneous acquisition of knowledge on all these different topics, it is really admirable, and it shows a great deal of investment in the topic and in the period and era. There are historical figures like Ben Lilly and Wesley Hardin, Roy Bean, and Kicking Bird. They're all very substantial figures from history with interesting and spirited reputations, and coming from a time where not everything could be known or well documented about them. And it makes something believable and tangible feeling about this book and about its stake in the whole matter of the Old West and the periods to follow. And I really want to sing praise about the tie-ins that we had between Lonesome Dove and this book, and then to switch things up, it seems like we saw a sort of pushback, a sort of revenge of the ladies, of the cast of characters. There's a lot of great female characters, a lot of women just making the best of the situation in this extremely gritty and hostile world, having solidarity and still being purely believable characters. But it was a nice change of the themes across the first book, which is excruciatingly male-dominated, in my opinion. At multiple times, I assumed I knew where our progression was going, and in keeping with his fashion, there isn't loyalty, blind loyalty, to these literary devices, these tropes, and these ideas of a happily ever after. It is a gritty novel, and yet it is not just heartlessly bashing you against a wall. There is something to root for, and there is something to hope for, and I loved the plot resolution. I loved the sort of epilogue. In fact, the epilogue really just made me smile, and I felt a strange sort of tearful joy at how things played out. It didn't feel cheesy, campy, or overly optimistic at all, but I was really happy for everyone who we're seeing in these circumstances. And the very nature of this text allowed me to feel suspenseful, on edge, and not sure if we were even getting the meager resolution and the unromantic sort of conclusion that it seemed like we were getting. You know, it kept me holding my breath to the very last sentence. Ultimately, I'll never stop recommending that people go check out Lonesome Dove, and as soon as they check out Lonesome Dove, I'm going to recommend that they do in fact check out Streets of Laredo. And for those of you who prefer audiobooks, I feel that this is an absolutely worthwhile production to go and check out. Please hop onto Libby through your local library and see if you can in fact rent a copy of this audiobook, because I think you'll be happy that you did. And I'm so glad that I got to share this with all of you, and I'm so glad that I got a chance to check out this book. Thank you so much for hearing me out and listening to my Audjoboox review. I believe I've found an audiobook version of Narcissus and Goldmund, a book that was recommended to me by a friend of a friend that I want to go ahead and check out here in the next week. So look forward to that, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.